most important event in Waylon Jennings' country music career took place before he ever recorded a note of country music.
Together, Jessi Colter and Waylon Jennings didn't just break the rules, they rewrote the script for an entire generation of country music. But behind the fame and music, Jessi Colter carried secrets no one ever truly understood. She survived the chaos of outlaw country and the weight of being the quiet force behind a man who almost destroyed himself. But there was more too. What really happened in that desert when Waylon tried to quit his biggest personal battle? Why did Jessi disappear from the spotlight after his death, and what did she find in the silence? The truth is both heartbreaking and complicated. Rise to fame and battle with identity crisis. She never planned on becoming an outlaw. In fact, for most of her early life, Miriam Johnson, who would later reinvent herself as Jessi Colter, lived by the. She was raised in a Pentecostal home in Phoenix, Arizona, and her days were filled with hymns, sermons, and the quiet discipline of faith. But even then, there was something else stirring beneath the surface, and a creative force pulling her somewhere unknown. Born in 1943 into a strict Pentecostal household, Miriam's early life was defined by structure, discipline, and unwavering religious devotion. Her mother was not only a devout believer but also a minister and pianist, and the home was often filled with gospel music, biblical teachings, and a clear sense of right and wrong. But even in those early years, Miriam was already quietly questioning the rigid boundaries of the world she was raised in. There was a tension growing inside her between what she was taught to believe and what she felt intuitively. She believed in God. She respected her upbringing, but she was also aware of a deeper, more complicated interest in music that didn't fit into the confines of the church. And even as a teenager, the quiet questioning would later fuel the spiritual depth of her songwriting and become the lens through which she viewed the world. One of the most painful turning points of her early life came with the tragic death of her younger brother, Paul. It wasn't just a loss, it was a rupture. Paul's passing left a lasting emotional scar on Miriam and deeply shook the foundation of her faith. In interviews years later, she admitted that his death changed her view of the world and her relationship with God. It introduced a kind of spiritual ambiguity that doesn't erase belief but complicates it. That tension would remain with her for decades and would eventually bleed into her lyrics, her melodies, and the overall tone of her music. As she got older, Miriam Johnson began to realize that her path wouldn't be inside the church, but somewhere else entirely. She had always played piano, a gift passed down from her mother, and by her late teens, she was performing in local clubs around Arizona. She had the kind of voice that made people stop and listen. That rare talent would become one of her trademarks. But back then, she was still just trying to find her place in a world that didn't often make room for women like her. In 1961, at just 18 years old, she married famous guitarist Duane Eddy, one of the most recognizable names in instrumental rock and roll at the time. Eddy was older, already famous, and deeply immersed in the music scene. For a while, it looked like a promising match. They had a daughter together, and Miriam got her first taste of the national music industry while traveling with him. But behind the scenes, things weren't quite so harmonious. While Eddy's star was still shining, Miriam often felt like a shadow that was present but voiceless. She had talent, drive, and ideas of her own, but the industry, and even her marriage, didn't seem built to accommodate them. That marriage, like many that begin too young and under uneven circumstances, began to fray. By 1968, Miriam and Duane Eddy divorced, leaving her a single mother with a growing sense of artistic isolation. More importantly, the end of the marriage forced her to confront a larger question that had been haunting her for years. Who was she really? Was she just a preacher's daughter who married a star? Or was she someone capable of being a star in her own right? It was in this period of uncertainty, in that uncomfortable space between who she had been and who she might become, that Miriam made a radical choice. She shed her birth name and adopted a new identity, Jessi Colter. The name itself was significant. Jessi had an edge. It was softer than Miriam, but more modern and freer. Colter, on the other hand, sounded strong, Western, and iconic. It was the kind of name that could stand on its own beside giants, and the kind of name you might find etched onto a record or headlining a tour. With that new name came a rebirth, both personally and artistically. Jessi Colter began carving her own space in the music world, and she didn't try to fit the mold that had been handed to her. She wasn't interested in conforming to the overly polished Nashville country sound of the time. She was drawn instead to the grittier, more rebellious branch of country music that was just beginning to find its voice.
As I sit here at night, the jukebox playing your song about
A movement that would later become known as outlaw country. Her timing couldn't have been better. The early 1970s were a time of upheaval and change in country music, and artists like Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings were breaking away from the Nashville machine, choosing instead to write, record, and perform on their own terms. Jessi Colter, with her raw honesty, bluesy edge, and spiritual lyricism, fit right into this new world. She was one of the few women in a sea of men, but she didn't seem interested in playing the role of female sidekick. She had her own vision, and soon she had her own hit songs to back it up. One of her earliest solo recordings, I Ain't the One, released in 1970 on LHI Records, was a strong step in the right direction, though it didn't find commercial success. Still, it was enough to catch the attention of musicians who respected authenticity, and it set the stage for her eventual breakthrough. She wrote music that was deeply personal and songs that pulled from her grief, her questions, her loneliness, and her faith. Jessi's entrance into the outlaw country scene wasn't just about timing. It was also about trust and connection. That connection would deepen when she crossed paths with Waylon Jennings, who was not just one of the genre's biggest names, but someone who immediately recognized something rare in Jessi's artistry. Their creative and emotional chemistry was instant. The next chapter of Jessi Colter's life would be defined not just by her music, but by her marriage to Waylon Jennings, a partnership that was equal parts complicated and enduring. But before any of that could happen, Jessi had to fight for the space to be taken seriously on her own terms. But even as her music began to take shape and her name carried more weight, it was her unlikely love story with Waylon Jennings that would truly transform her life, not just professionally, but spiritually. What began as a musical connection soon turned into a tumultuous but life-defining marriage that would test everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and survival. The marriage that changed her life. When Jessi Colter met Waylon Jennings, she wasn't just crossing paths with a country music legend. She was stepping into a whirlwind. Their connection was immediate, almost electric, and deeply rooted in mutual respect for each other's artistry. Waylon was a man who had already lived several lifetimes by the time they fell in love. He had experienced the highs and lows of fame, built a reputation as one of country music's most defiant voices, and carried with him the weight of personal demons that refused to let go. Jessi, on the other hand, had just emerged from the quiet identity crisis that followed her divorce from Dwayne Eddy and was determined to walk her own musical path. Together, they were both strong and fragile, powerful and deeply vulnerable. But their marriage was not a smooth journey. It was more of a storm they chose to ride out together. They tied the knot in 1969, and for the next 3 decades, their relationship would be marked by deep love, creative partnership, emotional strain, and at times, barely survivable chaos. At its core, their bond was rooted in loyalty. But it was also built on the codependency that often exists between two people who are both trying to save each other from their own inner darkness. Waylon Jennings was already famous for challenging Nashville's rigid system, but behind his rebellious persona was a man wrestling with personal pain. As his fame grew, so did his reliance on substances. By the 1970s, his habit had spiraled. According to multiple accounts, including Waylon's own, he was spending up to $1,000 per day on illicit substances. That figure wasn't just shocking. It was unsustainable and dangerous. The addiction was consuming him financially, emotionally, and physically. During this period, Jessi Colter was not a passive observer or the quiet wife in the background. She was fully present, living through the mess, trying to hold her husband together while keeping herself intact. In interviews over the years, Jessi admitted that loving Waylon meant accepting the chaos that came with him. But it also meant suffering through nights when he wouldn't come home, worrying whether his heart would give out, and trying to protect their family from the worst effects of his lifestyle. And yet she stayed, not out of obligation or because she was naive, but because she believed in him not just as an artist, but as a human being. Jessi has often spoken about how her spiritual background shaped her responses to Waylon's struggles. Her faith was never loud or performative, but it was steady. In many ways, it became the invisible thread holding their lives together when everything else was falling apart. The turning point came in the early 1980s, when Waylon finally decided to confront his addiction. He chose to quit cold turkey without rehab, without medical supervision, and without outside intervention. He and Jessi retreated to the Arizona desert, where he made the difficult decision to detox on his own terms. It wasn't an easy process. According to Jessi, it was one of the most agonizing experiences she had ever witnessed. She described it as though every bone in his body screamed out in anguish. For several days, she stayed by his side, watching as he battled both his physical pain and his psychological torment. There were no doctors, no medications, and no safety nets. Just Jessi and Waylon, isolated in the vast silence of the desert, facing down a lifetime of demons. Jessi later said that it was her constant prayers and quiet presence that helped guide him through those harrowing days. And against the odds, he pulled through. Waylon Jennings never returned to his addiction after that. It wasn't a perfect recovery, because there were still health issues, emotional wounds, and the lingering effects of a hard-lived life. But that moment marked a turning point. Jessi had stood by him during his lowest point and had helped him claw his way back to something resembling stability. In many ways, it was her strength and unwavering belief in him that made the difference. Their love story, though messy and complicated, was built on something far deeper than public appearances or musical chemistry. They saw each other at their worst and didn't walk away. They fought and they suffered, but they also created a home, raised a son, and shared a profound musical connection that never faded. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, as Waylon slowed down and began focusing more on family and selective projects, Jessi continued her own quiet but impactful career. She wasn't always at the forefront of the charts, but she had earned her place as one of the few women in the outlaw country movement with her own voice, identity, and enduring legacy. And even as her public appearances became less frequent, she remained an anchor for Waylon, for their son, and for the small circle of friends and collaborators they trusted. But while Jessi kept her focus on faith and family, Waylon couldn't always escape the weight of his fame or the controversies that seemed to follow him wherever he went. From legal troubles to industry feuds, his battle with the establishment made headlines, and Jessi was often caught in the crossfire. The controversial life of Waylon Jennings. Waylon Jennings was never interested in being polished or politically correct. He didn't fit neatly into the box Nashville tried to place around its stars, and he had no desire to play by the rules. That defiance, which was equal parts stubbornness and authenticity, made him a hero to many and a problem to many others. Whether it was his personal lifestyle or the music industry's expectations, Waylon's life was filled with confrontations, close calls, and moments that still spark debate. He was a man who lived on the edge, sometimes creatively, sometimes legally, but always on his own terms. Perhaps the most well-known and widely publicized controversy in Waylon Jennings' life came in August of 1977, and it was the infamous substance-related arrest that nearly derailed his career. At the time, Jennings was in a Nashville recording studio when federal agents from the enforcement agency stormed in with a warrant, alleging that a package containing a controlled substance had been mailed to him. According to court documents and multiple accounts, authorities had traced the package to a Los Angeles dealer and intercepted it before it reached its final destination, which was the studio where Jennings was working. The official charge was conspiracy and possession with intent to distribute, which immediately raised alarm bells. It wasn't just personal use that was being suggested. It was something far more serious in legal terms. But Waylon didn't panic. In fact, his reaction revealed just how sharp and calculating he could be, even in the heat of crisis. When the agents presented the search warrant, Jennings noticed an error on the document. He pointed out that the document had the wrong studio owner listed. He seized on that technicality and challenged the validity of the warrant, delaying the search long enough for the evidence to be quietly disposed of. By the time law enforcement managed to sort out the paperwork, the package was gone. Without concrete evidence, the charges didn't stick. Eventually, the case was dropped, and Waylon walked away without a conviction. But the experience left a mark on him, not just legally, but personally. It was a close call, and one that could have ended his career entirely had the outcome been different. Rather than hide from it, Waylon did what he always did best. He turned the experience into a song. His 1978 single, "Don't You Think This Outlaw Bit's Done Got Out of Hand," was a brutally honest reflection on that moment. In the lyrics, he confessed that the outlaw persona he had built was starting to take on a life of its own that he wasn't entirely in control of anymore. The song was self-aware, raw, and direct. It revealed that behind the fame was a man increasingly aware of the cost of his lifestyle. In later interviews, Waylon didn't sugarcoat the extent of his substance use during this period. He once said he bluntly confessed to using more illicit substances than anybody else he's ever known. It was a shocking admission, but also a testament to the transparency he brought to even the darkest parts of his life. There was no bragging in that statement, only a kind of weary honesty that hinted at regret. For Jessi Colter, that 1977 bust was more than a public scandal. It was a personal nightmare. She was inextricably tied to him, not just as a wife, but as someone who had invested years trying to help him stay grounded. The arrest brought unwanted attention and deep emotional strain. But once again, Jessi didn't walk away. She stood by him, just as she had done countless times before, and helped him move forward. In 1985, Waylon Jennings made headlines again, but this time, the controversy had nothing to do with substances or legal trouble. It happened in a Los Angeles recording studio during the historic session for We Are the World, the global charity single organized to raise funds for African famine relief. The song featured dozens of music legends, from Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie to Ray Charles and Bruce Springsteen. Waylon was invited as a representative of the country music world, and at first he showed up ready to participate. But during the session, a creative decision was made that didn't sit well with him. As the group rehearsed, a Swahili line was proposed for the chorus as a nod to the African roots of the humanitarian crisis the song was aiming to address. Waylon reportedly turned to the producers and said, "No good old boy sings in Swahili," and then quietly walked out of the studio. The moment caused a stir. Some accused him of cultural insensitivity, while others defended him, saying he was simply staying true to who he was and not comfortable singing in a language he didn't understand. Waylon himself later downplayed the incident, suggesting it wasn't a political or cultural statement, just a personal decision. He claimed he didn't like the way the session was being run and felt out of place. Still, the exit added another layer to the complex image the public had of him. To his critics, it reinforced the perception that Waylon was unwilling to bend. To his fans, it was yet another example of his fierce independence, proving that he was a man who refused to conform, no matter the stakes. And whether you agreed with his decision or not, it was consistent with the same spirit that had guided his entire career, authenticity above all else. Perhaps the most painful controversy Waylon faced was his battles with the music industry. From the beginning of his solo career, Waylon Jennings was in a near-constant battle with Nashville's tightly controlled music system. In the 1960s and early 70s, country artists were expected to follow a set formula of clean image, studio-approved producers, and strict creative oversight from the record label. But Waylon didn't just reject that model, he actively fought against it. One of the most important chapters in his legacy is his role in launching what became known as the outlaw country movement. Alongside artists like Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson, Jennings challenged the idea that country music had to be sanitized or corporate. He wanted creative control and the right to choose his own songs, hire his own band, and record albums the way he felt they should sound. This wasn't just about ego, it was about art. Jennings believed that country music had lost its soul, and he wanted to bring it back. But the industry didn't make it easy. He was constantly clashing with producers and executives who thought he was too rough around the edges. Still, his persistence paid off. In 1976, Wanted the Outlaws, a compilation album featuring Waylon, Willie, Jessi Colter, and Tom Paul Glazer, became the first country album to be certified platinum, selling over 1 million copies. It was proof that there was an audience for country music that didn't play by the rules. Jennings had not only carved out his own space, He had changed the genre entirely. Behind all of this rebellion was Jessi Colter, quietly watching the man she loved reshape the industry from the inside out. While Waylon was out front, breaking barriers and refusing to compromise, Jessi was creating her own legacy while still supporting his. Their careers were deeply intertwined, and every success Waylon achieved also reflected her quiet strength and unwavering support. But behind every headline, every arrest, and every onstage triumph was a man whose health was slowly declining, and a woman who was watching it all unfold in real time. When Waylon's final days came, it wasn't the music industry or the fans who saw him through. It was Jessi. And the impact of his death would leave a mark on her heart and eventually lead her to speak out after years of silence. Grief, faith, and solitude. When Waylon Jennings passed away in February 2002, the world lost one of the most defining voices in country music. But for Jessi Colter, the loss went far deeper than legacy or headlines. She had spent more than 3 decades not only loving Waylon, but also living alongside his storms, supporting him through his darkest hours, raising their son, and building a life out of both chaos and tenderness. His death was more than a goodbye to a husband. It was the closing of a chapter that had shaped every part of who she had become. In the months and years that followed, Jessi didn't chase the spotlight. In fact, she stepped away from it almost entirely. Public appearances became rare, and new music slowed. The woman who had once stood on the front lines of the outlaw country movement now retreated into something far more personal, quiet, and introspective. It wasn't a dramatic disappearance. It was a gentle fading into solitude, the kind that comes not from bitterness but from the weight of loss. During this time, Jessi leaned heavily on the foundation that had carried her through so much already, her faith. She had never abandoned the spirituality of her upbringing, even during the most turbulent years with Waylon. But now, with him gone, that faith became her lifeline. In interviews, she spoke of spending long hours in prayer, of reading scripture, and of sitting in stillness and asking God not just for comfort, but for clarity. She described this season of her life as one of spiritual reckoning, not a crisis of belief, but a return to it. The woman who had once questioned the divide between the spiritual and the earthly was now quietly rebuilding herself through both. And perhaps most significantly, she began the difficult work of rediscovering who she was outside of her most famous role, of being Waylon's wife. That title had been both a badge of honor and a shadow, depending on the season. But now, with Waylon gone, Jessi was faced with a question she hadn't truly had to answer in years. Who was she now? As a widow, as a mother, as an artist, and as a believer? The answers wouldn't come quickly, but they would eventually come. She began to write again. Not just music, but reflections that only come after you've lived through the fire and survived. And slowly, with great care, Jessi began to re-emerge, not with the same public persona, but with something deeper and more personal to share. It was in that quiet season that Jessi began to look back on her marriage, her faith, her failures, and the woman she had become. And what followed was a bold, honest memoir that would finally reveal her side of the story. The memoir that revealed the truth. For much of her life, Jessi Colter had been a witness to greatness, pain, and transformation. But it wasn't until later in life that she fully stepped forward to tell her own story. In 2017, she released her memoir, An Outlaw and a Lady, a deeply personal and poetic account that peeled back the layers of her long, complex journey from her early years to her marriage to Waylon. It wasn't a celebrity tell-all. It was something quieter and more introspective. With careful words and unflinching honesty, Jessi laid bare the parts of her life that had long gone unspoken. She wrote about the beauty and the heartbreak of her marriage to Waylon Jennings. She wrote about the love that never faded, the chaos that nearly consumed them, and the faith that held them together through it all. But she also went deeper than just recounting events. She wrote about her spiritual doubts, her personal regrets, and the emotional scars that came not only from being a witness to addiction, but from living within it. There were no villains in her story, only flawed, searching people trying to love each other the best they could. What made the memoir resonate was its tone. Jessi didn't try to rewrite the past, nor did she present herself as a victim. She offered her truth with grace, and in doing so, she gave voice to the quieter side of the outlaw era, the perspective of the woman who had stood by one of country music's boldest figures while holding on to her own soul. But Jessi's reflections weren't just about looking back. Even in her 80s, she has continued to create. In 2017, the same year her memoir came out, she released The Psalms, a haunting, deeply spiritual album that set ancient scripture to original music. The project, produced in collaboration with Lenny Kaye, wasn't designed for radio play or commercial charts. It was a meditative, personal offering that was a creative blend of gospel, country, and poetry that reflected the depth of her faith and the maturity of her voice. In interviews, Jessi has spoken openly about aging, legacy, and what it means to keep creating when most people expect you to slow down. She doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but she speaks with the calm authority of someone who has lived through every season, from joy to pain, fame, and loss. She continues to record, to write, and to reflect, not to chase relevance, but to tell her truth. Even now, at 82, Jessi Colter isn't just preserving the past. She's still evolving and choosing to live with purpose, creativity, and faith. Her story isn't just one of survival. It's a story of a woman who learned to speak not just through others, but for herself. Were you a fan of the outlaw country movement? Tell us in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.